Today is July 29th, 2006. I am Jessica Clark. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Regina, Saskatchewan, in Canada. To start with, can you please state your full name?
My name is Benedict Peter Ferner. I was born on July the 10th, 1928. I lived in a colony they call it 14 colony because it was on section 14 as land description. Really it is Catherine Tall. I was born there, lived there till 1939, where we moved to a farm about a mile south of Catherine Tall Colony.
Have you ever heard a story about your birth? Do you know if a midwife was present or a doctor?
No, I never did know. My mother dying when I was 14 months old, my father rarely talked about my mother or events around my mother. We used to go up to St. Joseph's Colony. That was my mother's home place for visits, especially in my earlier days before my dad got married again at the age of 6. He married again. My grandparents were very different. My grandfather was Peter Geiger, and my mother's name was Magdalena Dewold. My grandmother, we used to come and visit, and she would give me a nickel. Grandfather gave me a quarter or 50 cents. At that time, that was a fortune. So I was always hoping when I get in the door that it was grandfather that met us. He would take me out to the barn and he'd show me the cows, and he was just I would just wait to go to Grandpa's house. Grandma, yeah, she had lots of food. But after Dad got married again, we occasionally, maybe once every 2 years or so, I'd meet them. Actually, my grandparents wanted to adopt me after my mother died, but my dad wouldn't hear of it. And yeah, he took care of me very well. But I also lived about a block away from my aunt, my father's sister, and I would go out for breakfast, and I'd go out for lunch, and I was the adopted one in the colony. The neighbors they adopted me as a second son, or sometimes a fourth, fifth son. The one person that really struck my thoughts was old Mr. Bengard. He was an old man. He would always tell me to come, and she would have cookies. But the one thing that stands out in my mind, my dad had an old Model T Ford, and he used to go to town, go through the colony. And every time he would come from the end of the colony and he'd see us coming, he'd come out and want to ride. And the one thing about it, my dad would always sit me beside him in between, because he would eat garlic by the bushel. And he would go, and when he talked, he'd always talk almost right up against his face. So he had me as a bodyguard. I could hardly breathe at times. It was, but yet there was a tradition in the colony, and I guess the whole germ. Every New Year's, they would go around from house to house, wishing a Happy New Year. And the old folks would go starting at midnight. The younger folks would go starting after church. And Mr. Vanguard would always tell me, hey, Bendik, he'd call me. He said, come earlier. So I would come earlier, and he would have a 50-cent piece before the whole crew came. I guess I was just they were kind of soft towards me, I think. Anyway.
Can you share with us some of your earliest childhood memories?
My earliest? Well, when I started school, I couldn't talk a word of English. The teachers made a rule, you don't talk German in the schoolyard. In fact, we actually were punished for doing that. In fact, I got my first strap because of it, because we were forbidden to talk German in school. And but yet it was so mild that I don't think it would have killed a fly. I mean, he just had to show that he meant business, Me and my friend were playing X's and O's on the blackboard and talking German. But it took me, I'm sure, a month or so, and I was away with English. It went very quickly. I learned very quickly, I have to admit. Much more so than some of my comrades I know. That colony was kind of a happy family. They would take care of, well, I was always part of the family, wherever, and my father was quite relaxed too. He knew that I was taken care of. Even pulling us out of a mud puddle, I was punished with the rest of them, like a son. Other than that, we'd do our fighting amongst each other, but the ironic part of it was we'd be fighting in the front street, come around the back alley, be the best of friends. I mean, that was quite typical. Other than that,
do you want to tell me a little bit about what school was like?
What was school like? I don't know. You learned to read. I was very good at spelling. We used to have these spelling bees, and I have to, now this may sound like bragging, but I very often landed up on the top of the class. I'd envision the words in my head, and I could, that was my strong point. But, and I could very easily go take a row of figures and just go right down and add them up. Those two things. But later on, when I got to geometry, I don't know, I lost it somewhere.
So did you attend a one-room schoolhouse?
Yes, with 8 grades, and later on even 10 grades.
Were grades 9 and 10 taught by the teacher, or were they done?
They were a correspondence course, but the teacher helped if they needed help, which didn't go too well as far as I think I got a bad start in geometry and algebra.
Was this in the colony?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you have the same teachers every year?
Oh no, we had some very strict teachers. I had about 4 of them, even 5. Yeah, there was 5 of them. Yeah, but they were teaching all grades. Eh?
Can you tell me a little bit about your favorite teacher?
Yes, I think it was Mr. Burrell. He he was he was single at the time, and he used to visit us a lot. Mom and Dad. He'd come for supper, and he was very gentle, very. I wish I'd have had him for another couple of years. I would have learned to read music, because he just got me started, and he left, and the rest was. I never did learn after that.
So was he having you just read music, or was he teaching you how to play?
He was teaching us the notes and music, you know, to read notes, to sharps and flats and all this type of thing. And he also convinced my parents that you should get him a guitar.
So did you continue to play the guitar?
No, I still fiddle with it, but not too much. Every once in a while my wife twists my arm, so I bring it out.
Let's see here. Can you tell me how they would teach 10 grades in one room with only one teacher? How did classes go?
Well, he would go into, they were in sections, see? Like he'd go to the grade 5 and teach them geography or in the history. And then he would, for the grade 2s, maybe he had on the board, he had some fractions or whenever the fractions were. And he would go from grade to grade. And each were assigned, now you take page 5 and you do this, and you know. But all day it was I don't know how they did it, but they went from grade to grade in their sections. Sometimes grade 3 and 4, for instance, had the same section of arithmetic or history lesson, and then he'd talk about it. Shall we say he wasn't twiddling his thumbs?
He was busy.
Busy, yeah. Yes.
How far was the school from where you lived?
Oh, about a 3-minute walk.
So did you walk even in the winter?
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. Well, actually, I lived in the colony, and the school was in the middle of the colony. So how long does it take to go?
Would you go home for lunch?
Yes,
Okay.
except when it was storming. That one thing that stayed in my mind was one stormy day, my father didn't bring the lunch to school. And what's going on? This is so finally I was hungry, so I went home, and here the horse had kicked him that day. He couldn't walk. So that was the one time that stuck in my mind. But it was never that bad that you couldn't see where you were going.
So when you guys were living in the colony, was your dad farming at that time?
Yes. He lived in the colony, but his the land was, the one quarter was about 1.5 miles away, and the other one was 3 miles away. And he would leave early in the morning, and that's when I went to the neighbors to have breakfast. He'd be so early that he'd make sure I was up before he left, and he had already eaten, and so I'd go and have breakfast.
So since you grew up for 6 years, you didn't have a woman in the house.
Off and on, my aunts were there. Yeah, there was 2 aunts. The one aunt was determined she was going to adopt me, but I didn't want to go away. I didn't want to leave Dad. Yeah, there was the 2 Aunt Julia and Aunt Catherine. And of course my aunt that lived about 1/4 mile away, and that's the one I had breakfast with all the time. And she had her own family. They had 10 kids. So I was the 11th one. But you wouldn't know the difference. It's treated the same.
So did your dad know how to do some cooking? And
Yes, he could fry eggs and cook porridge and bacon. In those days, they would butcher a pork, and they would salt it, and then they'd put it in a gunny sack, not a gunny sack, it was a heavy kind of and they'd bury it in the grain. They'd salt it and smoke it, and then bury it in the grain to keep it away from, and it would keep. It was good.
so, what your dad, when it was just you and him before you got remarried?
Yes.
Would he come home from the farm in the evening and have dinner with you?
Yes, but and he had a very shrill whistle, and wherever I was, whether it was playing with and I recognized it from the other end of the colony. He would just put his fingers in his mouth, and he would whistle, and you could hear it for a quarter of a mile, unless it was windy, unless not. And I heard that was meant come home. And it was very rare that I didn't hear it. Very rare. And if I didn't hear it, then he would look for me. He'd go to the other end, and then eventually I would hear it. Well, where were you? Well, we were playing in the. Oh, well, okay. But I didn't dare ignore it.
There would be something to pay with you didn't.
Yeah, he didn't say much, but it meant a lot.
What was your dad's name?
George. George Andrew. George.
Can you tell me a little bit about what type of a person your father was?
He was a very caring person. Of course, he had to be with a son roaming around. His education, I think he only had a grade 4. He left school. Well, grade 4, he had to help on the farm. He grew up in the stage of horses. He loved his horses, and they were always ship-shape. Of course, I grew up with horses, and later on, in my early teens, I was driving a 6-horse team out in the field. He was very meticulous about caring for them, and I thought sometimes to the extreme. He was very generous, though, with me. Money-wise, I know sometimes he didn't know how he's going to pay his taxes, so the crops were poor in the 30s, and yet I seemed to take priority. Things changed a bit when he got married again. It was a different atmosphere. But I consider myself very lucky.
Would you say you were close to your father?
Yes. I didn't stay anywhere overnight unless Dad was there. Of course, I didn't have a mother, and so he was almost like my pillar,
What types of things would you do with your dad when you were a kid?
Well, he didn't do too much, like recreation-wise. In those days, it was mostly working. He'd go out in the field, and I'd have to clean the barn, even at the age of 8, 9, 10, and that sometimes took quite a while. I was in charge of getting the cows later on. The big thing was we'd go to every Saturday, most of the Saturdays, we'd, not every Saturday, we'd have a Bennett buggy and 2 horses, and we'd go all the way to Regina from there. And it took about an hour and a half. Go to the livery station, a livery stable, and it was close to the Army Navy store, etc., on 11th Avenue. And there we would go to a restaurant to eat. That was a treat.
So how often did you say you would go to Regina?
Oh, once every 2 weeks maybe. Because we got our groceries from Chrono.
So when you would come up to Regina, was it just you and him, or was it the entire family?
Well, no. I had with Dad's I had a step sister and a step brother, and once they were on the scene, then we had a car. Then we had an old 1928 Chevy. But then it got, once with the car, then by that time I was old enough, I usually had some chores to do, clean the chicken coop and do some weeding in the garden. And later on, I was in Regina oftener up to the age of 7 than I was after that for years, by the time I was old enough to work and to give me responsibilities. But I didn't get to Regina too often at all after that.
So your dad, you said you didn't know his parents. You didn't know your grandparents on that side of the family.
Apparently, my dad's father died in 1926. That must have been just before he got married.
Do you know how he died?
He had pneumonia. He developed pneumonia. They said he was shoveling a culvert, and he was in a sweat, or I don't know. That was their story, that he came home and he started having trouble breathing, and he went to bed, and 2 days later he was gone. And they called it pneumonia. Of course, no antibiotics. And
what was his name?
Benedict.
You were named after him?
Yes.
And do you know your grandmother's name?
No, she died way, she was, good grief. Anyway, it'll come later. Mariana.
She died way before your
Yes,
grandfather
yes.
did.
Yeah, she died long before, I think in the early 20s. My dad wasn't that old at the time.
Did your dad ever talk to you about them?
Yes, about his father. And he said, his father was very strict. But he said, and he liked his little nips of whiskey. And he said if he wanted anything, he had to wait for the right time. And when he had a few little sips, he says, I could ask him anything. Oh, sure. He said it had to be timed perfectly.
So he knew how to work his father.
It was Mariana Thomas.
Do you know if your grandparents came over from Russia to Canada? Do you know anything about that, or?
Yes, my grandfather came over as a single person. Okay. And here he met Mariana Thomas.
Do you know how many children they had, your grandparents? How many?
he was, my dad had two sisters, and then he got married again, and then he had two sons and three daughters. He had 5 children after that. So my dad had 5 siblings, step sisters, and
Okay. Did you grow up knowing all of your aunts and uncles?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you, your dad's 2 sisters, what were their names?
Elizabeth and, oh, why do I get blanks here? Joe and Tony. Joe and Tony's mother. Oh, and I was with her every day. Anyway,
Well, why don't we,
keep a blank.
yeah, why don't we talk about Elizabeth for a little bit? And maybe it'll...
Elizabeth, they were out in Fox Valley, Prelate area.
Did you get to see her often?
No, maybe once a year.
Okay.
But they would, either they would come or she would come, and, oh, it was Aunt Barbara. It was, yeah.
So when you would get to visit with Elizabeth, can you tell me a little bit about what you remember of her from your childhood?
Well, we'd only be there for a day or so. I don't remember. There wasn't that much contact
Okay.
at all.
And you said you would see Barbara.
Barbara, she was the one I had breakfast with all the time.
Okay. And so she is the one that had 10 children.
Yes.
So can you tell me a little bit about your Aunt Barbara?
She was a second mother. Oh, the love and discipline was all went with it. She's a very caring person.
You mentioned discipline. How would children be disciplined when you were growing up?
Oh, if necessary, a spanking. But mostly you sit in the corner, or you're not going to have any dessert, or it varied, or kneel in the corner, you know. She, of course, the cousin that just died, I mean, me and him were kind of a headache for her, I think, because, I don't know, we were into things that, anything that we were told not to do, that's what we sought out to do. You know?
Is that the one that you had mentioned at breakfast with the loaf of bread?
No, that was another family.
Okay. So you were into all sorts of mischief.
Yeah.
Okay. You said you would have breakfast with Aunt Barbara
Mm-hmm.
quite often. Was she a good cook?
Yes.
Do you remember some of the meals that she would cook for you?
I'll tell you one thing that I did like. She cooked a big pot of porridge, and I love porridge to this very day. And she would, and every once in a while, I would come up there, and one of them, I would just hope that one of them wouldn't want theirs this morning, so I could have a double. Yeah. It was, occasionally there was times when I can't have any more. I mean, I'm full. Anyway.
You said she had 10 children, so those would be your cousins.
Yes.
Do you remember, you said you were closest to one. What was his name?
Joe and Tony.
Joe and Tony?
Joe was younger, and Tony was my age, actually. But Tony was kind of the quiet guy, you know. He was him is one thing that I would mention. Tony was his father was a dairy person. He shipped milk, and every morning he would go to town and take the cans of cream to the training, cans of milk, anyway, he'd come back with a chocolate bar, or of course I was always there to receive, Anyway, and I remember this one incident where he'd come and give us each a bar, and Joe and I would have, we'd have ours eaten so quick, and Tony would say, this is too good to eat. But I'll tell you, before the morning was over, we got part of his too. There's a difference in personality, and I was more on Joe's personality. The two of us were, I think it made Aunt Barbara's hair gray. But anyway, but yet.
What types of things would you do with Joe and Tony for fun?
Oh, go out down to the swimming hole. We'd group in with the L boys, and they would play hide and seek and play ball. Go to the gooseberry patch and sneak some gooseberries down there. And his father had a garden. He had gooseberries and strawberries, and we would be down there oftener than we were supposed to be, I'll tell you, especially once they ripened. And he wondered why they disappeared. He did catch us there one day. He just chuckled.
So you mentioned that you would go down to the swimming hole. Did you know how to swim?
No, never did learn to swim.
So would you just kind of play in the water?
Yeah, get each other good and wet there.
And then you said you played ball. Was this like an
At the school, that would be the school. At school, we'd choose sides, and
did you have equipment to play ball, like a baseball bat and
a bat and a ball,
no gloves?
but no gloves. Catch a bare hand. Ouch.
Yeah.
I still have a thumb that's was turned back at one time. Anyway.
You also mentioned that your grandpa remarried and had more kids.
Yeah.
He had 5 other kids with his second wife?
I'd have to count 2 boys, and there's Aunt Katie and Mary and 4 girls. There's 4 girls and 2 boys. I said 3, but it was 4. And
Did you know any of those?
Oh, I knew them all.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to tell me a little bit about what they were like?
The one that really stuck in my mind was Aunt Julia. She was something else. She would, when Joe and Tony's father died, she came to the funeral. Anyway, and of course I called her my kissing aunt. She would come, and this is no lie, I was standing right beside the grave where they in those old days they let them down, and here is Aunt Julia. They always called me Benny. I was a little orphan, I guess, or whatever. Anyway, Benny, she'd come a foot away from the grave. Hello, Benny, and she'd give me a kiss on the cheek. Or lipstick, I think she had lipstick on an inch thick, and it was just a blotch. I was so embarrassed, I just about collapsed into the grave. And she always was this kissing aunt. I mean, she would smother you. I couldn't wash off my face after. But she was also the one that took care of me when after my mother had died for 2 years. She was with my dad. And so I guess maybe she was that fond of me. I don't know, or was she just a kissing aunt? Anyway.
So did she move in with your dad to help?
Yes, at that time, yeah.
So was she not married at that time?
That's right, she was single.
And you said that do you remember any of your other aunts that your dad's other sisters?
Well, Aunt Elizabeth, I don't know too much about her, but Aunt Mary Eistetter, she had two boys my age too, and they would come out for summer holidays. But other than that, we'd go in there. We'd go to Regina, and we'd usually drop by there. Before we'd go downtown, especially once we'd go with the car.
So they lived in Regina?
They lived in Regina, yeah.
What were her two boys' names?
Wilfred and Robert.
Were they close to you in age?
Yes. Wilfred was a few months older, and Robert was about a year younger.
When you came into Regina to visit them, what type of things would you do with Wilfred and Robert?
Go to the store for licorice and whatnot. Well, they horsing around.
So you mentioned that you would go to Regina, fairly often. What was in Regina at that time? What did Regina, was it a big town or?
Oh yes. The area around 11th and Broad was just 2 blocks out of the outskirts, and now look at it. It was. They almost lived on the outskirts of town, and now it's in almost the center of the city. I mean, it just. I guess the excitement of it all. We'd ride on the streetcars for a nickel, and they'd have the tracks down the street, I mean, and then we'd get a nickel for get ourselves an ice cream. Or one thing about at that stage, we used to go to the grocery store at Chrono. That woman was kind of spoiled me rotten too. She'd go under the counter and give me a chocolate bar, or without my dad even knowing it sometimes. The more I realize, I'm getting embarrassed how spoiled I was.
So can you describe the town of Chrono? What was in that town when you were growing up? Because there's not much there right now.
No, there's hardly anything. There was 2 stores. There was 4 elevators. There was the Imperial Oil dealer, and about 4 or 5 houses maybe. But all the surrounding area would get their groceries from the 2 grocery stores.
So how often would your father and you head into Chrono for groceries?
To get the mail, at least once a week. It was about 5 miles from where we lived.
You obviously didn't get to know your mom real well because she died when you were so young.
No, the only recollection was what I mentioned.
Your grandparents, you mentioned a little bit earlier at the beginning, and said before your father remarried, you would get to visit them quite often. What were their names?
Peter Geiger and Magdalena, Geiger, but she was a Dewold, maiden name.
Do you know if they came over from Russia?
I don't know.
Okay. And did they live relatively close to you when you were growing up?
St. Joseph's Colony. I don't know whether it's east of Balgoni.
So that's near where the grotto is, right?
No, the grotto is St. Peter's.
St. Peter's, okay.
That is about 14 miles north of St. Peter's,
Okay.
approximately.
So how long would it take you to go visit them? Would you have to take the horses over from where you were growing up?
Yeah, we used to go with the horses. It would take us a couple hours.
Okay. When you would go over there, Did you speak German with your grandparents?
Yes.
Do you know if they ever learned English?
Oh yes, but they had a different dialect of English than we did. Um,
How often would you visit them before your dad remarried?
a couple of times a year anyway.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about your grandpa? Like, what type of a person was he? What his character was? You mentioned that he was generous with you.
Very gentle too.
Okay.
Very gentle. He'd take me on his knee even, or just stand me beside him. I just got that feeling of a real warmth from him. And Grandma was more or less the business type, very stern.
How many children did they have?
Yes, those are things I should have put. 1, 2, San Margaret and Elizabeth. I think I wrote it down on the chart that I had, but 3 boys. 1, 2, 3. I think 4 girls.
3 boys, 3 girls?
3 girls.
Oh, including then and your mom, so 4 girls.
Yeah.
So Tom, Anton, Anton, Peter, Teresa, Margaret, and Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you know any of your aunts or uncles on that side of the family?
Oh yes. Uncle Tom was the joker. Uncle Tony was my godfather.
Really?
You know, or Anton, whatever Tony Anton.
How often would you get to see your aunts and uncles on that side of the family?
Well, usually when we went up there, they were usually there on a Sunday afternoon.
And you said you were close to 2 of your aunts on that side as well, or?
Yeah, well, Aunt Margaret and Aunt Elizabeth. Yeah, they were. I think they both were going to adopt me. I think. I mean, from what anyway, they were very. But anyway, they'd come to visit us, and they were, well, very warm towards me, shall we put it that way.
Okay.
When I was there, I was part of the family.
You said your dad remarried at 6. Who did he remarry to?
Matilda Fallman.
And do you know how he met her?
Well, they lived within a 2-minute walk in the same colony.
What did you think of Matilda when your dad first married her?
I felt put out. I remember the wedding day like it was yesterday. And I considered her an intruder. And I guess that wasn't too good as far as the start was concerned. I remember the wedding day so much. I was in I can still see myself sitting at the landing of the step, and they were dancing downstairs. The wedding occurred in the house, in the parents' house, and there was no other kids there. I was the only one. I remember sitting in the corner and kind of not feeling too comfortable about the whole thing, and even at that age, I was kind of, what's this all going to be about? You know, I still remember that.
Did you eventually warm up to your?
Yeah, there was some feelings that I think were self-created, you know.
So can you describe your stepmother for us? What was she like after you warmed up to her and got to know her a little bit?
That's a difficult question. I guess there was never that feeling of warmth that you see kids towards a mother. Although my father was a very, I think he kept, I know I was at times a little bit of a cause of friction between them. I know that for sure, but never anything that's serious, I don't think.
And you said that, did they have children together?
Yes,
Okay.
a boy and a girl. I had a stepbrother and a stepsister.
And what was your brother's name?
Harold.
Harold. And can you tell me a little bit about Harold?
Well, he was a school teacher. He was the one that always had his head in a book. I was out at doing chores, and Dad would always have to get him out of the bedroom. He was behind. So he went to school, and he went to university, and he was principal in Regina for a couple of schools for many years. And he passed away about 3 years ago.
How much younger than you was he?
About 7 years.
So when he came into your house, did your responsibilities change a little bit, or did you have to help take care of him at all, or?
I think it helped because I was almost like wherever he went, I was there, kind of. They felt more secure when I was with him. You know, they knew that I wouldn't let anything happen if I could help it. So I think I really feel it helped. You know, Mom and Dad would go out milking, and I'd be babysitting, and if something went wrong, I'd call them. And I think it eased up when my brother was born.
And you said you also had a sister?
Yes.
What was her name?
Diane.
Can you tell me a little bit about Diane?
Yeah, Diane, she died when she was 35 years old. She had 5 kids. Before she got married, we were very close. Harold was at school, and she was at home for quite a while. We'd milk the cows, and we'd sing, and she was more than a sister. She was a friend, and I was very, very, when she passed away, I was devastated. That's when I almost lost my faith. in God. You know, he had 5 kids that I just couldn't understand how something can happen. And her youngest child at the time was also same age as when my mother died. And I remember taking that little girl to see her mother in the coffin, and that was the worst thing I could have done. That I regretted. She just about flew out of my arms. Mommy, mommy. That was a hard one. Anyway.
How did she pass away?
Cancer.
So when you were kids, what types of things would you do with Harold and Diane for fun?
Not too much. Fun wasn't really a priority in those days. You know, he would have friends down the street his age, and I would have friends my age down the street. But when there was a whole group, I kind of had usually a guardian eye over him. I often.
So let's talk about holidays for a little bit. What the holidays were like when you were growing up.
What holiday?
What was your favorite holiday?
There really wasn't any. After school went out, it was weeding garden and cleaning barns, and really never went for a holiday as such. So actually, there was times when you kind of hated when school was over, because you'd be back with your friends, and you'd sometimes we'd go to the odd sports day where we'd play ball. But as taking a holiday as such, like they do now, is was non-existent in our lifestyle.
Can you tell me what sports day was like?
Well, they had, of course, the ice cream booth, and they had ball teams, softball, baseball, running, and sack races. And then, of course, the winner would get a nickel or a dime. That was about it. I guess it was more or less the getting together.
Let's talk about some other type of family get-togethers, socializing activities. What about Christmas time? What was that like?
Christmas time was more going to church, and that was about it. Other than that, you'd have extra food and occasionally some of the family would come in. And of course, in those days, you'd plow 5 feet of snow. The cars were in the shed; they were snowed in, so it'd be horses. But church was a priority in those days, whether it was 40 below or it was, as long as you could see where you were going, there was just no such a thing as missing Mass.
So you would go every Sunday, or would you go
every Sunday? And in Christmas time, there was Christmas Eve, and then again Christmas Day. And then on the Feast of Stephen, and if that was on the next day was a Sunday, you'd go on Sunday again, you know. So later on, there was, when we got older, we had a bit of a hockey rink down in the creek, and that was, we'd spend 3 hours of shoveling the snow off the rink because it drifted the night before, to skate for an hour.
So did you have your own pair of skates?
Yes. Actually, my father's old skates. Yeah. I never did get my own.
Did they fit your feet okay?
Oh, I'd put an extra pair, couple of socks. later on, I didn't need any socks. I had just a small pair of socks. Anyway.